Thanks very much for joining us, Jochen.
It's a pleasure to be here. I feel privileged.
We met 2 years ago when you took over the reins of Siemens Gamesa. I think it's fair to say that as you went into the role, you were braced for interesting times, challenging times. And probably the news flows would suggest that your expectations were pretty accurate. Can you talk about the mechanics, the forces that have meant that this huge opportunity, this massive demand for the products that you turn out, these wind turbines onshore and offshore, how that massive demand, massive opportunity has actually turned into something that's challenging, not just for you as an OEM, but many of your competitors as well. What are the inner workings of that?
Yeah, happy to do so. So first of all, I think when we look at the market, we have to see that the market really is huge. There's loads of studies around. There is sometimes political influence there. Then there is political ambition around. There are sometimes new targets for specific regions or countries more than once a week. So sometimes it's not so easy to keep track. In all cases, we are discussing substantial enlargements of the existing installed capacity. And that typically easily ends up with hundreds of gigawatts to be additionally installed per year. Now, if we look at these numbers, you have to see that sometimes we distinguish between onshore and offshore, which is a different thing. 60% sometimes of the overall installed capacities have to do with China. That as such is a market which for us is not accessible. There is a very clear and very strict Chinese policy in place. But even so, I mean, the yearly extension of the market really is in the range of certainly above 100, 150 gigawatts. And this now on the onshore side is a little bit more stable. So there we these days only see growth rates of 6%, whereas in the field of offshore we sometimes see 25, 30%. And that of course is a lot. And that needs to be dealt with. We typically do this in projects. Projects have a size of sometimes up to 3 billion euro in volume. That typically is a little less in gigawatts. So you easily end up with larger projects with a substantial risk profile, and they need to be delivered on time and according to all those influence factors. I think that's absolutely clear. Now, if you do this, then you want to deliver. Going forward, this sometimes means that there is an introduction of technologies and sometimes even new technologies, and those new technologies need to be developed and qualified even sometimes, and that also is a challenge. But of course, over the last years, the growth of a turbine has developed massively, I can say. I mean, one of the biggest turbines which we now see in operation, there's always announcements around. But one of the bigger turbines which is in operation is also ours. So you go up this tower, it's 170 meters high. Then you stand up there on this platform, 170 meters typically is rather high. Then you have this thing which is supposed to generate some 14, 15, 16 megawatts. You know, you go up there, then the rotor starts turning. The rotor doesn't really turn fast, so it's turning some 7.3, 7.4, 7.5 rounds per minute. So you wouldn't consider that as much. It's very fast. Still, you have a blade. This blade these days has a length of, well, our serial blades right now reach a length of 115 meters. So a standard football field has a length of 85, 90 meters sometimes, so it's considerably longer. And then this thing turns, and when this thing turns, the speed by which the tip of the blade cuts the air is in the range of 320 kilometers per hour these days. So that is more than Formula One speed. And this is how this thing then starts turning. It rumbles a little bit, so you see it's... You look down there and think, oh yes, yes, and this is how it goes. The nacelle, as such, this is this element where the energy generation is happening. This is these days a 3-story house. Yeah, so you inside have stairs. You can go up 3 stories. just to share the dimensions. And this is how the technology has developed. It has developed over time. It also has weaknesses, but I think I'm still impressed, and perhaps it's not visible for everybody, but I would consider this as really high tech.
And when I first got involved in offshore wind, I guess a decade and a half ago, something like that, 10 years ago, I was assured that, then we had 6 megawatt, 7 megawatt machines, and these were the most enormous things we were ever going to see. And there was a technical limit of 10 megawatts. I was assured that we could never see a turbine bigger than that. And yet, every 3 or 4 years, we've seen growth in the size of the turbines, and it went up through 10, and you've got your 14, 15 megawatt machine spinning already. And it has felt that there was a race going on there. I'd be interested to hear your views as to how that rate of growth compares with what you see in other technologies. I know you've seen conventional energy, CCGTs, whether you get longer on a given platform to make money there, and whether that has been an important distinction between what's happened in wind and other products you put out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's understandable that you need to have a certain minimum life cycle, if you wish, for a certain platform, and at the same time you need to be also mindful about not being lost out on the progress which is made elsewhere. Please do remember this is an innovative space. Yeah. So in the field of gas turbines, we have typically life cycles of let's say. While a platform typically also is a suite of programs and a suite of also updates and upgrades, but in the classical energy field, you typically have the life cycles up to 20 years and even longer. Although there are updates in the meantime, in our space, you sometimes had life cycles below 2 years, and that is of course then not really healthy. One of the first things I had to do was to actually prolong the life cycle of our products. Which at the same time does not mean that we stop everything which is innovative. We just have to see that the life cycle of our products really extends above 6 to 7 years, which I would understand as a healthy figure to make sure that there is also a little bit of profitability coming out for the manufacturer. Because if that's not given, then obviously the story has an end, rather quickly.
Yeah. And when we look at the sort of inner workings of the way that you produce, it's really noticeable that this has become a very international activity for you, sourcing largely products or components that you generate yourself, but from factories all over the world. Can you talk about that, the extent to which it's driven purely by economic rationality versus the need to appease governments looking for industrial pull-through, if you like, and to see activity happening in their own markets?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you very much. I mean, we still have a trend, like in other industry sectors as well, that first of all, this is a very international business. So, for instance, when we look at Europe, we have, when we talk manufacturing, we have sites in Denmark, we have sites in the UK, we have sites in France, we have sites in Germany, we have sites in Portugal, we have sites in Spain, we have sites in France. This is Europe, but then we also need to look beyond Europe. We have Taiwan, we have India, we have China, and we also have the US. So it is quite a mix, and it's not so easy to balance. And also sometimes this sheer complexity goes beyond perhaps what we would call a sort of greenfield setup rather. But fundamental seems to be that local governments are really interested in attracting additional local value add, and then would like to make that a requirement for any kind of, let's say, project-based cooperation. And this is, of course, very difficult because this leads to subcritical setups. It leads to a variety of other disadvantages, and this is what we sometimes suffer from.
Yeah. And that's not abating, is it? That pressure. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US came across to some observers, me included, as the convergence of sustainability policy, climate policy, with with industrial strategy,
Yeah.
with a very domestically driven industrial strategy. Are you still finding that you have to react to that? And
Well, first of all, I have to say I was extremely impressed. I mean, the time when this came to life, suddenly the effect, in my view, was more psychological, and suddenly everybody started to have discussions on future volumes, and even in our case, so-called repowering volumes, which are completely different fantasy. There was nothing concrete, but everybody suddenly was positive, and we need to do something. This is always great. And it's still something which attracts, in my view, a lot of investment, also coming away from, for instance, Europe. The other side of it is that part of that should also be related to offshore. And offshore these days is a little bit of a bumpy business when it comes to the north, to the east coast, but also the other parts. But the east coast is front runner, and there we see a lot of perhaps effects coming from some too high level of heat, from some overheating of the market. We have had commitments given out. We have had requirements, also in the sense of pricing, which were impossible to meet. We've seen strong competitors. We've seen strong customers of our side. I mean, we are manufacturers, so the developers, the wind farm developers. We've seen some of them really struggle, having had large write-offs. And as far as the US is concerned, that is not over yet. So in my view, we are a little bit also well advised to observe how that is developing going forward over the next 1 to 2 years. I honestly do believe that the US are one of the core markets and one of the key markets also to really drive this kind of part of the energy system forward, part of the energy system of the future. I mean, for me, it is absolutely clear that wind continues to be part of the energy system of the future. It sometimes needs to be looked at how that is being shaped. But in some parts of Northern Europe, you already see consistent contribution to the electricity consumption in the country of more than 50 up to 60%, and that is in majority coming from wind. And the plans which we are aware of and the plans which we are working with are actually exceeding that number. So there is no future without wind in those areas. And then, of course, we need to look at stuff like solar. We need to look at batteries, storage in a broader sense. And of course, we need to look at the contribution of, for instance, nuclear when it comes to France. Yeah? But in principle, in my view, there is still an extremely promising market, and we just have to, I think, manage it in a slightly more relaxed way, which is also more sustainable and which does provide the right levels of profitability to everybody else in the value chain. And I've been extremely vocal for requesting a couple of changes. Many of these changes right now are addressed by the so-called Wind Charter that has been taken up by Ursula von der Leyen on her agenda short prior to Christmas. And as far as Europe is concerned, there's a commitment of all the member states and then also of many major players in that field. And I was very happy to see that coming true. And the UK always ran a slightly different agenda, but still they have put a lot of emphasis on wind. And I hope that can prevail.
Just turning now to inputs. One of the questions we get from our investors sometimes, and that we're certainly very watchful of, is that this enormous investment, this enormous recreation of our generation fleet over the next couple of decades, already underway, it's going to consume a lot of natural resources. And people are watchful as to whether we actually are going to be able to access those volumes. We watch it and have certain views, and certainly our colleagues in the Commodities and Global Markets team watch it. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think we have to see that in most cases we are really actually in a global world. Access to resources is a global question. Sometimes raw materials are coming from certain places, oftentimes in Africa, in our case, because we use, for instance, magnets quite a lot. Then, of course, it is clear that the mining industry as such, there was the reach out from the Far East onto those mine areas. When it comes to the refining of those materials, it's sometimes more than 90-95% or so with the Chinese. That needs to be looked at and needs to be looked at carefully. I think going forward, sometimes there is this term of decoupling in the discussion. I'm not sure that this is the right approach, but I think we need to have something like a controlled partnership where we actually are aware of what we are using from where and potentially make sure that we also have alternatives at our disposal. So we right now, for instance, are setting up for rare earths and magnets supply chains from Australia over to Japan for the refining and then going back into our direction. This is being set up. It is so that, however, sometimes also our customer needs to understand this and needs to be prepared to pay for that. And that is sometimes where the discussion is not so easy. But at the same time...
I'll look forward to that, Jochen. Yeah.
But at the same time, for instance, green technologies are really being asked for by the customer, and they would also, in cases, in a very defined way, of course, accept additional pricing.
When we talked about industrial policy, but of course the great intervention by many governments around the world over the last decade that puts us where we are today is really impressive intervention for the the protection of our climate and the reduction of carbon. Do you see that we're still getting the right level of intervention from government? And as we see, I talked about the fact that a lot of the demand that it animates the development we do these days comes from private sector demand, but that doesn't get us all the way there. Do you think governments are still doing enough to give you the visibility to plan factories and volumes that were...
No, I think that's still underdeveloped. This is something also we've been asking for long times. The overall planning horizon seems to be somewhat limited in many cases, but then it's not only about that. It's also about, let's say, rather administrative stuff. So permits take too long. When it comes to offshore wind farms, we sometimes have permitting times of up to 7 years. 1.5 years ago, Ursula von der Leyen in Esbjerg said, well, we're going to reduce that down to 1 year. I would be happy to see that, yeah, clearly. But it's not there yet. We have had a wrong auction design, so the assignment of any one piece of land or water to somebody who is a wind farm developer. This thing oftentimes happens via so-called auctions, and there we sometimes see in our view criteria which need to be optimized to better cater for what's needed. But I think the most important point really is around, and this has come up rather recently, is around the question of energy sovereignty and energy independence in a way. So I think with the perhaps increasing volatility in also the political landscape, we have to see that the provisioning with energy cannot exceed a certain level when it comes to even in terms of blackmailing in this context. And this leads then, in my view, to, and rightfully so, to a perhaps more strategic approach. That means if I look at this strategically, I would say for a certain kind of energy, I need to make sure that I have the capacity to innovate in that energy, that I have the capacity to manufacture in that energy, and I need to make sure that certain elements of my energy system as such cannot be controlled by somebody who later on can be seen as perhaps not fully as a party on our side. And that did develop over the last months, I have to say. And this strategic approach, however, in my view, is still a little bit underdeveloped, because this kind of focus on needed resources, on needed innovation capacity, on needed manufacturing capacity, this is still not there throughout the countries. And I would like to see a much stronger element of that thinking also with our partners. And if we now compare our approach here in Europe with what is coming from China, I mean, there is nobody more strategic than them. They have established some probably 15 years ago that this is something they want to be active in, they want to be playing on this. It's centrally organized, they get subsidies, they can move away from our pricing conditions, so something which we call a level playing field is certainly not given anymore. And in that direction, we kind of look a little bit like, I sometimes have the impression that people are laughing about us because of all the difficulties we have and all the rules we give ourselves, versus others just go. And this is certainly true for China.
And Jochen, we have a short period left. Just you stepped into that difficult job 2 years ago, and you know the outturn has been that there are challenges there. Can you characterise, and certainly you're not the only CEO in your activity who is having to work as hard as you are, but can you give us your prognosis for the future for your company and the challenges that it's got to working towards profitability and making all that volume add up to, you know, an income productive business?
Yeah. Well, I think it's known and been part of all the publications that we have had a couple of difficulties, both in the field of onshore and as well as in the field of offshore. We've given ourselves a clear plan to be back in profitability after 26, so that is the year of break even. This is communicated, this is what we strive for, and this is what we're working on, and it's our intention to get there. We have a lot of plans in place to actually get there. It's certainly going to be challenging, but our hope still is that this is the future. I honestly do believe that wind is seriously going to be a very important pillar of the energy system of the future, and we are doing everything to make that come true.
And I'm sure you will.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jochen.